So thank you for joining this virtual event. I'm thrilled to have all of you here today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kim Edwards with the Teacher Enrichment Program at the Center for Excellence in Education. And today we are very excited to have Amanda Smolinsky, who is the Assistant Professor of Kinesiology at Roanoke College. Amanda, I will just let you take it away.
All right, thank you guys all for coming out to Bite of Science this evening. My name is Amanda Smolinsky. I am currently a visiting assistant professor of kinesiology at Roanoke College, so right here in Roanoke and Salem. And I'm so excited to be talking with you this evening about some of my research and some of the things that you can do to improve the skills that your students will need if they want to pursue a degree in biology or anatomy specifically. So first of all, who am I and why am I talking to you, and what makes me think I'm qualified to be addressing you this evening? First of all, I got my biology degree, a Bachelor's of Science at Roanoke College. I graduated in 2008. And I focused on general biology just broadly, as well as doing a distinction project on zebrafish hormones during development. I then got my Master's of Philosophy, which is the British equivalent of an MA in Human Evolutionary Studies at the University of Cambridge. And then I took a few years off before starting my PhD in integrative anatomy, where I focused on clinical anatomy. So I took gross anatomy with med students and then focused the rest of my coursework on evolutionary biology and functional morphology. And while I was doing that, I also got a certificate in science outreach with over 100 hours of public outreach and coursework on public understanding of science. So that's what I look like on paper. I have, at this point in my life, 3 years of full-time teaching experience, mostly in clinical anatomy. I just completed a postdoc in Denver at a medical school where I was teaching physician's assistants, masters in biomedical science students, and DOs, so doctor of osteopathy. And I'm currently starting my second year teaching undergraduate anatomy and physiology labs here at Roanoke College. My research interests all stem from a basis in evolutionary biology. So I consider myself a biologist first, and any good biologist has to have some sort of root in evolutionary thinking. Within that, I specialize in anatomy, specifically of the musculoskeletal system, though I'm familiar with and have taught the entire body, including neuroanatomy. And I consider myself a functional morphologist. So what shapes does the musculoskeletal system take, and what does that allow an animal to do with those structures? So how does form relate to function? And my specific research interests lie in locomotion and skeletal biology. So if I were to give you all of that information or give you my CV, it would look like my path to becoming a scientist was fairly linear, but that is leaving out quite a bit of my journey. So let's go back to the very beginning. I feel like all kids are born scientists. They're always asking, why is this? And like, how does this work? And I feel like I never really grew out of that. So I feel lucky that I'm in a career where I never had to grow up and leave my inner child, kind of, as it were. I was always inventing things or building things or trying to do science experiments in the kitchen, and trying to keep myself interested in science and active in science even as a kid. But it wasn't really until college that I decided that I wanted to pursue research. I originally wanted to go to med school because that's what smart kids did, and we didn't really, in my family, know anyone who was a scientist. So once I got into an academic setting and realized that I could have a job where my daily work was discovering things and making new discoveries, was something that was new to me, and I was really excited by that. So I earned my biology degree and with an honors research project that I did working with developmental toxicology in zebrafish. So I did a project looking at how pesticides can disrupt growth and signaling in the embryos. And that was a really formative experience for me because it made me decide that I wanted to be a researcher, but it also let me know that I hate working with DNA and I don't ever want to pipette things ever again. So it really kind of set me on a career path where I knew I wanted to do research, but I knew I wanted it to be on something that I could see and hold and move around with my hands, not just under a microscope or in the computer. After graduating, I took a gap year where I did about 3 months of behavioral research looking at the effects of pharmaceuticals on mice and zebrafish, and I realized I hated that too. I wanted to do again something that I could hold and touch and be like, this is the thing that I'm working on. So after I got out of that, after that summer, I worked as a pharmacy technician. Just to kind of make ends meet before I then applied to that master's program. I knew I wanted to work with fossils. I knew I wanted to figure out how bodies worked and moved around. So I spent my 10-month master's degree looking at pelvic morphology as apes evolved into humans and comparing those and how those animals move around and how we came to move around. And I feel like that was a really satisfying thing for me mentally and really put me on the trajectory of what I wanted to focus my career on. After I got back, I actually took 3 gap years. As soon as I got back with my master's, I worked in a dog kennel for 1.5 years, where I got to scoop poop as my daily job. So my mom likes to joke that I spent however many thousands of dollars to be the most overqualified dog kennel assistant in the country. But I did eventually apply and get a neuroscience research job where I was working with memory in rats. And my job was to build the implants that they would put in the rats as they ran mazes so they could detect their neurons firing as they ran mazes. So that was a really fun job. I got to work with my hands. I loved the work there, but I don't think neuroscience was really the direction for me, but it was a line on my CV that I could use to get me to where I wanted to be. So I eventually then finally entered a PhD program at the University of Missouri, where I was going to work with bones and movement. I wanted to look at fossils, but also relate them to how animals move today. So kind of an evolutionary spectrum of how does evolution work, how do structures evolve, and how do animals use bodies to move around, so locomotion. So I decided to specialize in functional morphology of the locomotor system. Once I defended my dissertation, I started a postdoc at Rocky Vista University in Denver, Colorado, where I was teaching clinical anatomy. So I had the background for my PhD in anatomy from a medical perspective, and I did 2 years learning how to teach, how to write exams, and how to become a better professor. And that was a limited time job. So now I'm here at Roanoke as a visiting assistant professor of kinesiology. So I have a 3-year term, and I'm going to be working with students who are either pre-med or on some sort of pre-occupational therapy or physical therapy or sports training track. So that's where I'm at now. So look at that in pictures. That was kind of a lot of words. So the majority of my job is teaching. Here's a picture of the lab bench last week. I was teaching anatomy and physiology of the peripheral nervous system. So we have bone models, the skull and the spinal cord, and I really love interacting with students, especially in the small class sizes that we have here. Another part of my job, though, is doing research. So designing experiments and conducting experiments and getting those, analyzing things and getting them out and out into the world. I've gotten to work with numerous different animals as models. So zebrafish and mice and rats I mentioned earlier, but I also did a project looking at the strength of the alligator mandible. So how strong they are. They can bite really hard, but how does their head resist those forces? So that lots of different animals that you can work with as an anatomist. I also had the opportunity to go for a week for 2 summers to dig up fossils near Richmond, where it was Carmel Church Quarry. So here's a picture of me digging a few years ago, and we dug up a few whale whale jaw fossils, and this is a turtle humerus here, so both live and fossil animals. But you don't just get to do research, you also have to communicate your findings. That's part of being a scientist. So I have gone around the country and actually to Europe as well to talk about my research and share ideas with other scientists. And then down at the bottom here is a picture. I've been an invited speaker at events like this and at museums where I get to talk about my research as part of public outreach. And like I said, public outreach is one of the things that I am really passionate about. So I also have volunteered at museums. I do outreach events with schools and with the community. And I actually got a chance to turn some of my research into a stand-up comedy routine with a group called Science Riot that takes real scientists and has them tell stand-up just to get people excited about science and see what scientists are actually like in a funny way. So it's kind of all of my job in picture form here. And you get to go all over the world. So if you like travel, maybe being a scientist is for you. So I've got blue dots here and all the places that I've gone to school, but I've also, or work, but I've also traveled around the country for these scientific meetings to collaborate with other scientists, to go to museums and look at their collections. So I get to travel around a lot too, which is great. So I'll spare you talking about some of the teaching. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, and I'll focus mostly on, for the rest of the talk, on the scientific research portion of my job. The job as being an assistant professor it's required to get promoted that I have a functioning research lab, that I bring students in and give them research experiences. And depending on the type of school that I'm at, or that a student ends up at, it can range from, it's nice to bring in a little bit of grant money and apply to the NIH or whatever and get that, to it's expected that you'll bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars and support your own salary. So depending on the institution you end up at, it can be very different how much research is required to support your job. So I like where I'm at here, where I can kind of balance my teaching with some research. I'm also expected to publish papers and be engaged with the scientific community in my field. And that goes on my resume and helps get me promoted. And then I have to mentor students in research experiences. So bring in students who are interested in doing science so that they can have an experience like I had, help decide, is this the career for me? It helps them get into medical schools, dental schools. It looks good on a resume there. And just to foster that sense of discovery in other students, even if they're not going to go into a career for research. So speaking of the research that I like to do, I'd like to now kind of pivot to what I'm interested in, the kind of projects that I work on. I am interested in locomotion. How animals move around through their environment is essential to vertebrate behavior. It underlies behaviors like searching for food, escaping predators, finding mates, defending territories. So locomotion is something that all vertebrates have to do, and it really underpins their lifestyle. And if we take a look at their skeletons, we can see that there are all sorts of ways that bones have adapted to allow different types of movement through the environment. And what I'm interested in is how, over evolutionary time, these shapes of bones come to be and what they allow animals to do. So the types of questions that I ask as someone who's interested in locomotion and the skeleton are, what does the shape of a bone tell us about how an animal moved around? So these are the forelimbs of a horse and an armadillo, and they contain the same bones, but you can see they're shaped very differently because they do very different things. Horse limbs are long and tapered so that they can move more quickly and allow the horse to run, while an armadillo's arm is really short and stocky and strong with big muscle attachments, so it can provide powerful strokes for digging. So just looking at the bones of these animals, we can tell what they did while they were alive. I also looked at how bones change as animals adapt to new environments. So here we have an example again of the forelimb of a human, a dog, a bird, and a whale. And again, the colors match up to homologous bones. So they're all made of the same bone identity, but those bones are bigger or smaller or fatter depending on the function that they serve. So having elongate bones is good for running or flapping, whereas the whale has kind of shortened up some of those other bones to make a good flipper. And we can tell that it's adapted to the new environment. And finally, how do bones grow and change over a single animal's lifetime? So the shape of a bone in an embryo is different from that of an adult, and it continues changing and growing and responding to signals throughout an individual's ontogeny. And one of the questions I'm interested in looking at is how does this individual change relate then back to evolution? So let's take a look at what bone is and why I think it's exciting. So bone is a mechanically sensitive tissue. It can sense and adapt to physical forces that are placed on it. So the contractions of muscles or impacts with the ground are going to induce microscopic bends and twists in the bone that it can sense. And most of the time, those forces are going to fall in this physiologic loading zone. We can see on this graph that as strain increases, we tend to get increases in bone mass. Well, at the same time, if we fall out of this physiologic loading zone, bone mass tends to decrease. So it's kind of a use it or lose it system with bone. So for example, here we have the cannon bone of a horse. So that's one of the wrist bones. And you can see how thick it is there. And this is just a normal exercised horse. But if we then take that animal and we don't exercise it at all and becomes a couch potato, what we see is something very different in the bone. It's sensing that the bone cells are sensing that they're not being used. So why waste material and energy maintaining that bone when we could just resorb it and do just as well? So you can see here in this trivially loaded horse bone that it's much thinner here up at the front, and it's full of all these tiny little holes where calcium has been resorbed. So as if you don't use bone, you tend to lose material that builds it. At the same time, the opposite is true. So here is a silhouetted cross-section of the humerus or upper arm bone of a person. And this is just a normal humerus. But if we take that person and train them as an athlete from a very young age, the thickness of that bone increases, and so that it's the same outside diameter, but the inner marrow cavity has shrunk and filled with bone. So these are actually scans from the same individual. One is the playing arm, which is thick, and the other is the non-playing arm, which you can see is much thinner. So this doesn't just happen overall in the body, this is happening on each side of an individual. So from this observation, I wanted to ask the question, what type of forces or what types of exercise can grow the strongest bones? So I actually went through the scientific method, which you're probably teaching some of your students. My observation was, we know that bone changes in response to exercise or locomotion. So I developed a hypothesis. My hypothesis was that high impact exercise, such as jumping up and down, will cause bones to grow stronger than if there was muscle-driven exercise. So muscles pulling on bones tends to be different than impacts. So I designed an experiment using mice to look at the thigh bone and look at changes on bone shape and density. And I designed an experiment. So I have my 3 experimental groups here. I had mice that did jumping, mice that swam, which is removing impact and just muscle driven. And then I had them running on wheels, which is a combination of impacts with the ground and strong muscular contractions. And that was my control group. I had mice who just stayed in their home cages and did no exercise. So my methodology was to have those mice do their exercises, and then we would CT scan their bones. We would take those CT scans and using computer software, build 3D renderings of the bones in the computer. And then we would take cross sections of the bone from the middle here, which looks like this, and analyze those for shape and bone mineral density. So that looks something like this. The measurements that I take are from, we would go in at each of these cross sections of the grid and measure bone mineral density so we can get an idea of what the average is over the entire cross section. And then we would take measurements of structural strength. So here's where we bring in things from engineering like bending resistance and torsion resistance. And those are based on diameters and the thickness of the walls and the spacing of the material around the center. So there's a lot of math involved with these. And here are just kind of jumping to the results. I won't bore you with too many details. What we found was that bone area and in diameter, we actually found significant differences depending on the type of exercise that the animals performed. So we've got on these x-axes down here which group they're in, and then on the y-axis we have bone area and diameter from anterior to posterior, so size. What's interesting is that we found that in the running and the swimming groups, rather than exercise leading to increased bone strength, it actually led to smaller, thinner bones, which is associated with a weaker shape, which is really interesting because we have read up on this saying that exercise should improve and increase bone strength. So that was really strange. If you want to take a look at what that looks like, here are some examples of the control group, and you can see how thick it is on this backside, whereas in the swim group, it's a lot thinner. So we were really puzzled by this. And we had to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new hypothesis. Maybe the bone material, so bone mineral density, is what's changing, so that they can afford to be lighter in these weaker looking shapes because they're changing the material and they are actually stronger. So then what we did was take a look at bone mineral density. I had a student working on this over the summer, and we found that looking at averages for bone mineral density, there actually is no change. So we've got, again, on the x-axis our treatment groups, our exercise groups, and then we have a relative measure of bone mineral density on the y-axis, and each of these dots is a mouse, and then the red dots are the average and standard error. So you can, there's a tendency, again, for run and swim to actually be weaker, but based on the spread and the number of mice we have, it's not really significantly different. So we come to the conclusion that we have decreased structural strength from the shape, but bone mineral density is the same, which means that the bones in these two muscle-driven exercises, running and swimming, are actually weaker than if they'd done no exercise at all, which is completely contrary to what we expected to happen. So how do we interpret this? Our next step in the scientific method. So we found that bones could potentially become weaker after exercise, but we know that other researchers have found that exercise increases strength. So we figure genetics has to be playing a role here in how bone responds to exercise. Everybody's different, right? So just like I can go to the gym and someone else can go to the gym and work out, and I might not gain much muscle, but someone else might. Like, I'm just not built for gaining muscle. At the same time, people can do the same exercises and either gain bone or lose it. So genetics is playing a larger role here than we originally thought. It's also possible that maybe the femur isn't the best place to look for these changes. We are planning to move on and look at other bones of the limb. We're looking at the tibia next to see maybe position within the limb, there's some sort of gradient that will yield different results in different bones. So there's exciting stuff coming up in the future. So what does all this mean for you as a teacher? There are a lot of skills that I use every day when I'm trying to do this research. Those are science skills like creative and critical thinking, going back to the drawing board and coming up with creative answers for problems, designing experiments where I have to think critically about what could be influencing what's going on, how to control different scenarios, troubleshooting problems. And then these last few are ones that we're having trouble with our freshmen in our class now, making and interpreting graphs, drawing conclusions from data, constructing an argument supported by evidence rather than just the thing you learned in the textbook and I'm gonna parrot that. Like, no, use the numbers in this graph and tell me why you have evidence for your argument. And then, especially with anatomy, using these 2D images from x-rays and things like that and thinking in 3D and moving those shapes around in your head. So those are all science skills that you need to have if you're going to go into this line of work. But there are also non-technical skills as well, kind of soft skills that a lot of our incoming students also have problems with at the college level. Time management, organizing their notes and their writing, study skills. If they've gone through high school without having to study much, by the time they get to college, they don't understand what it means to study. It's not just reading over your notes the night before a test. You have to make flashcards. You have to really sit down with a group and work through your answers. You can't just parrot things. You need to understand why they happen. And then efficient use of references. I don't have every detail in my field memorized. I have to look things up, go back to textbooks, go back to published papers. So how can I search for and find that information quickly? And then finally, just knowledge. And this would be stuff coming from textbooks and that they would learn from class. So biology is really inclusive in that we have to draw from chemistry, math, physics, and skills in writing to be a good biologist. Big picture biology principles are often where we get our hypotheses from before we go and look at specific instances and see if they fit with theory. And then just being able to use and be familiar with products like Microsoft Office. I had to tell a student earlier last week that he has to actually install Microsoft Office before he can work with the spreadsheet for his homework. So just, they're digital natives, but they're not necessarily familiar with some of the software that they're going to need for the rest of their careers. And then there are experiences that you can give to students who are thinking of becoming future biologists. Look for volunteer opportunities. There are places you can sign up to go to Utah and go on a fossil dig for 2 weeks. You can work at museum collections, being a fossil preparator or any sort of collections that they have. Shadowing opportunities are also available. See if there are any science or health themed community or after school programs in your area. I know I've personally worked with underserved middle schools and had kids who wanted to be doctors when they grew up come in and look at our dissection lab, and they had a great time and asked some really good questions and got them excited about science. You in your classrooms can contact scientists to Zoom in and do little lectures or guest talks. One example would be something like Skype a Scientist, and they do K through college, I think, where you can just, I want a real live scientist to come talk about their job for a day with my class. I've had a lot of fun doing that too. As they're getting closer to graduating and going to college, encourage your students to look up colleges that have undergraduate research experiences. Not all colleges let undergraduates do research. So while they're looking, they can look up UROP, which is Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program. And they often offer stipends to do that. They can also look at the department that they're thinking of majoring in and look at what the faculty work on to see what kinds of opportunities are available. And then here at Roanoke College specifically, we have a Research Fellows program where you apply as a college, high school rather, senior, join as a college freshman and to work in a lab and receive a small scholarship and get paid to do research during your time here. So that's a program for interested students as well. With that, I'd like to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time, and here's my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you guys so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda. You know, maybe an audience clapping if we were in person. Just figure I'd let you know.
Thank you.
Okay, so now for some teacher questions. One we have is, so you had mentioned the bone density, like the bone thickness of like the tennis player and their, tennis, like their playing arm versus their non-playing arm. And like, does that bone, I guess my question would be, does that bone thickness then have like impact kind of anything about their like muscular skeletal system?
Yeah, so the bone becomes thicker, but usually when you're done growing, it becomes thicker towards the inside, so it's not really pushing stuff out of the way. But in some cases, it can leave what are called muscle scars. All those little bumps on your bones on a skeleton are actually from muscle attachment sites. So there are some anthropologists who think that actually you can tell if you find a burial site somewhere, whether the local people were like paddling canoes or throwing spears or something like that, just based on the shape of their bones. It's pretty cool.
That is very cool. So I know you had mentioned a couple of new sort of like ideas for like, this mouse bone density question that you have. What do you think is your most likely sort of avenue, if you have any?
To move forward with the research?
Yeah,
so we're going to start up probably next month looking at different bones. Like maybe the thigh bone isn't the place to look. Maybe it's the shin bone instead. So we're going to look there. There have been other papers saying that maybe there's some sort of concentration gradient of the forces, like your foot's hitting the ground and maybe that force dissipates by the time you reach the thigh. So it's not really receiving the signal like, hey, I should beef up to resist this force. So maybe the shin's the place to go. If we don't see anything there, it's entirely possible that maybe the genetic strain, the background of these mice is such that they just don't respond to exercise, and it's a genetic background thing. I know anecdotally, I had, when I was doing another science outreach event, someone came up to me and said, like, I'm 40 years old and have osteoporosis, and my doctor keeps telling me to do exercise and nothing's happening. I just keep losing bone mass. And I think that's the kind of result that doesn't get published a lot, because it's not what we want to see, and it's kind of, we would call that like a negative result. Maybe we're just not doing the experiment right. But I think the genetic background is definitely an avenue for research for how bone would respond, because everybody's different.
Yeah. And then so I have a teacher here who just started, they teach research methods, and they just started a biomechanics course. And they were wanting to know if you had any suggestions for labs, or like biomechanics labs or lab equipment, especially that's cheap, because budgets are limited out there.
Yes. I don't work with biomechanics specifically. I know you can get software like Bone Load, but I think that is probably pretty expensive. One of the things that I like to do that's free is you can go on a website like Overt or Morphosource and look up different skulls of different animals that people have CT scanned and uploaded, and just compare the shapes and look at like how big is this area for muscle attachment. Like they have a big sagittal crest like a hyena or something because they bite hard, and that's where all those muscles attach. Things like that. Comparing skulls is a really easy. If you have real skulls to show them, that's even better. But some of the weird ones that are hard to get copies of, I like using the online ones, because they make like 3D PDFs that you can spin around in 3D, so it's fun.
They are really fun. Awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda.
Yeah.